So welcome everyone. It's so cool to see such a full room. Hello Tara. Let me quickly make Tara a co-host as well. Great. It's nice to see so many people here. We are going to dig into the maybe controversial topic of pedagogy versus andragogy. Is it a battle? Is there a big difference? If there's a big difference, or if there's some nuance, how do you teach for different audiences? Or how do you design instructional experiences for them? That is the topic of this workshop. We want to include you in this discussion as much as possible. So please feel free to share your thoughts or your ideas or your disagreements in the chat. We really want to keep this like a as much as possible like an engaging session. I am going to quickly briefly just say some names, and then we'll nominate them to quickly introduce themselves. Tara is going to be working in the background. Tara, I'm actually I might say your name a few times. So Tara is on EduFlow's side, and then we've got Matthew from Lesson Space and Room.sh, if I'm not mistaken, and then Brenna, who's working at Muse. The other day I was also watching, or today actually I was watching a video from Genially where they do a little tutorial, and I realized that this is Brenna's voice. Brenna's for a long time was the voice of Genially, which is really cool. So maybe we can start with Brenna. Would you mind unmuting to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. So yes, my name's Brenna. I'm currently the senior instructional designer at Muse, which is a software for hospitality for hotels. Prior to that, I was at Genially on the training team, and my kind of first start in my first job, let's say after university, was teaching English as a second language to both children and adults. So I hope I can kind of bring that double-sided perspective to today's conversation.
Cool. Matthew, go ahead.
Thanks, Will, and hello, everyone. My name is Matthew. I'm actually the CEO of two different education companies. One is called Lesson Space. It's like a Zoom for education. It is used by students, teachers, adults, youngsters around the world. So we got a lot of insight into how to design tools for different audiences. And then we also run a company called Code for Kids, which is also used in a number of kind of English-speaking first language English-speaking countries. And there we are primarily building content for age 8 to 15, but I'm seeing in the comments so many people are teaching adults, and a big part of that company is our Teacher Academy, where we are training teachers to teach the students. So definitely we'll try and focus on that side of things. Thanks, Will.
Cool. Tara, can I put you on the spot quickly to just introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Tara. So I am with EduFlow right now. I facilitate some different courses that we run specifically about instructional design for adult learners. And then I have a lot of experience working with both college-age students in student affairs, as well as youth and like high school students as a math teacher.
Cool. Okay. I think we're going to have a really awesome session. We've got some awesome perspectives. I'm going to start with the first question. Maybe it's controversial. Maybe it's not. I see Jared posted a link in the comments about Andragogy. Is there really a difference? We'll find out today. Brenna and Matthew, how would you describe the difference between pedagogy and andragogy? What are your thoughts?
I'm happy to jump in first. I think the main difference that I see, at least, of course, let's see if there's any discussion here, is that andragogy is more learner-centric, where the learner is the person who takes the lead in their learning and what they're going to learn, compared to pedagogy that is more teacher-centered. The students or the learners really rely on the teacher to pass on information. If I were to kind of summarize it into 2 sentences, that's what I would focus on as the difference.
Yeah, nothing really to add there. I think the definition is almost a little bit poor in how we've kind of defined it, as the one is only for adults, the one is only for students. I think the thing we'll learn a lot and speak more about is how maybe having the student at the center is potentially better, regardless of whether it's an adult or a youngster having a lesson or learning. So yeah, I think that the definition can be maybe a little bit controversial, but the kind of difference is exactly one adult, one student-centered, and one teacher-centered, if you like.
That's a really good point. Tara, feel free to, you also welcome to jump in and share your thoughts as we go. I've written some things down here because this is like an interesting topic. And I mean, if we think about just the two terms, pedagogy, the like strict definition is just teaching children, and andragogy is teaching adults, like the Latin roots of the two terms. And I think that's the big difference. But I found that a lot of people use the term pedagogy as an umbrella term for both, or for everything, because then we can go one step further and go, there's this other thing called utagogy, which is is it self-directed or self-determined learning? I think it's self-determined learning, right? Yeah, so something like that. Anyway, so it's like maybe a bit semantic, but what we thought about talking about for this session is to maybe make it more practical and to draw from your experiences, and considering that you were in the thick of it, or you are currently in the thick of it from both perspectives. What in your experience have been some of the big differences between designing learning experiences for either audiences?
Well, I think another kind of big difference between the two terms, or at least that you read about in the theory, is that pedagogy a lot of times is related to having the milestone be met with a grade or an assessment. So you pass this because you took a test and you got an A on it, and now you can kind of move forward, right? Whereas with andragogy, or with teaching adults, it's more filling in the knowledge gaps where they are. Because with andragogy, what we talk about a lot is that adults are coming in with prior experience already. So it's not kind of foundational learning. It's, okay, I have this experience, I can relate to this topic, but I need to fill in the gaps a little bit. So I think that that's one of the kind of the really big differences that I saw, is that giving an adult, right, a training, and then having them answer a multiple choice question, does that really show that they're able to put into practice in their job, let's say, what I've just trained on? Not necessarily, is my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think something I don't know, Will, if I'm allowed to ask a question for the chat, and I'd love to just also get a gauge.
Go ahead.
I think it's, thanks, Will. I think it's these kind of questions, or this kind of, my question to the chat is, what is typically the most type of teaching you're doing? Is it synchronous or asynchronous? Is it in person or is it online? I think there's a huge sort of forking that happens in these kind of different quadrants, if you like, because teaching something asynchronously is very different to teaching something synchronously. How you might have to create this highly framed environment when students are progressing through something at their own speed, where you will never be able to connect with them, and you can allow this region of far more collaborative learning if it is in a space in the same way. Something, I mean, I'm just giving a quick gauge of what people are doing: asynchronous, mostly synchronously online, asynchronous. Yeah, a good mix. And I think, yeah, 50-50. I think that kind of highlights how it is something that I think somebody also mentioned there in the chat. This kind of umbrella term can definitely be something that maybe misses a few parts of what it's trying to define. We do something with our teacher training at Code for Kids, where we teach the students the 3-step problem-solving approach, and it's something that we ask them to implement with 12-year-olds in class. So the 3 steps are quite simple. The students are sitting in a classroom with their computers, and we say, okay, students, you don't have the answer, put your hand up. Step 1 is the teacher has to check that the student has tried. So you want to see that the students tried it. Step 2, the student can speak to their neighbor and ask for help, and they can use their mouth but not their mouse. So you can't do it for your neighbor, right? We train the teacher on how to do this for the student. And then step 3, the teacher only ever answers Socratically with a question. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? And what we see, we do a lot of lesson observations, is we see that the teachers who do the least teaching and the most questions are where the students thrive the most. And that's where the students are showing the most success through the content. So that's working for us. And that's why our system is designed to be taught in a classroom. It's not done online in an asynchronous method, because it doesn't have the same learning outcomes as it does when it's taught by a teacher who's been trained on how to teach it. Just as a kind of a little example of how different it can be, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. Yeah, I hope that gives a little insight.
That's interesting. I think another point that we talk about related to the difference, and that I've seen, and that kind of shows that it doesn't have to be children versus adults, is in the motivation. So I think a lot of times when we talk about Andragogy, it's that there's this intrinsic motivation. I'm learning something because I want to, so I'm going to put the effort in. Whereas pedagogy, and if we look at the theory, is the students are there in the classroom because they have to learn something. So I think that that's a big difference to look at too, where you can say, I've taught adults English as a second language, and one of the first questions that I used to ask them in the classroom was, why are you taking this course? And for some of them, it was because I want to travel and I want to be able to communicate. And others were, well, I need to get this certificate in order to, keep my job or get my degree, whatever it may be. And that motivation, I think, really showed a lot more like what they were willing to do outside of the classroom. Some go just, okay, teach me, and then they would come the next class, teach me this. And others, oh, I watched TV, I listened to music, I read the lyrics, I'm trying to read this book. So I think also motivation, where maybe Matthew, with your case in coding kids, they're interested in it, I think, as well, if they're doing that. So I think that also plays a really big role in having them engage and retain the learning.
Yeah, thank you. Go for it. We'll go for it.
I just want to throw in refer to a comment here in the chat. Attila mentioned, mandatory corporate trainings. Does that, is this considered pedagogy? Or, do we have these strict controls? Or because we've put in these strict controls, and sometimes it feels like you're telling someone to learn something for the sake of learning, which is probably an example of an awful compliance training experience. But that's often what it feels like. It feels like you've gone back to school, and I'm sure other people might have had different schooling experiences. But if I think about back and in my school time, it was sit behind a desk, don't bother the person sitting next to you, and stare at the sage on the stage for 45 minutes, which was an absolute torture for me. And that sometimes that's what we associate those feelings with corporate compliance training, because there's this video that you can't skip, and you have to watch a little. You're not even watching the training material, because often it's really bad, but you're watching this little play bar moving across the screen, and you're just waiting for this loading screen to finish so you can do this quiz that is going to ask you the most obvious questions, so that you can report somewhere that you've done it. And that's quite like an interesting contrast to draw between what we think of as pedagogy or like learning as children from our own experiences, and what we're doing in real life. But I think what Matthew is like, I think Matthew's got a really interesting perspective, because he came from the space of being in a school, and maybe because both of us came from South Africa, we had a very similar kind of like schooling type of curriculum experience, and now you're almost trying to teach differently than the way you were taught when you were growing up. Is that the case? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that if you'd like to share.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And I think, the kind of taking a step sort of up or backwards is, I think it really is so dependent on what your constraints are in how you're delivering your teaching. There's that famous study, that Bloom's 2 Sigma study, where it shows that small group tutoring is 2 Sigma 97% more effective than in-group or a classroom of 30 students teaching. And if you think of a classroom of 30 students, it's a teacher having to kind of do this, you know, even if it's in a school, well, I mean, at a school level, it's a teacher just kind of being a lecture, being a video, and kind of telling the students what's happening. In the small group, it's inquisition based. It's really trying to figure out the exact problem where the student is having, or the exact problem the student's having. So like, you could even think that there's software out there that does these very kind of clever analyses of like trying to understand really what is the math problem a student is having, and then drill down to the root cause of that problem and try and kind of come back up to teach the students. So you could argue that that's like a part of trying to what's Andragogy is doing, but on a kind of student level. And I think it's, you know, there's also the other side of the coin where I'm sure you've been in a workshop where there has been someone teaching to you and you kind of just wish it was a 5-minute video that you could watch at 2 times speed, because it could have. I think there's some examples in the chat of exactly that. And the kind of last example I had, or was just thinking when I'm coming to mind, just seeing a lot of the kind of corporate training that is happening with our audience. There are certain things where pedagogy is probably better, and it probably fits in a world where there is far more kind of constriction on what's like right or wrong. If you're learning like a medical exam or a legal exam or something that like, these are the policies you need to tick word for word, you've got to get them right. That's not necessarily something where a Socratic method of asking questions to the student is necessarily going to be the most valuable. If it's kind of I don't want to say a box ticking exercise, but something where these are the 5 policies, like you've got to know the 5 policies. That is, you know, pedagogy, even to adults, can work in that regard, I would guess.
I'm kind of like thinking also, like, you know, we say the word pedagogy and we associate it with like maybe like that rigid training experiences, but you also get pedagogical practices that are very open, you know, like, and very learner driven and stuff. So I want to maybe emphasize that, you know, pedagogy isn't bad. And I think there's a lot we can learn in terms of the way we teach, or the way we the stuff that we know is really good at teaching adults can also translate to being really effective things for teaching learners. Maybe Brenna, can I put you on the spot here? Because you've come from this perspective of being a teacher, and now you've gone into the corporate context. Would you like to tell us a bit about your, you know, maybe you've had to swap your lenses out a little bit, because you've kind of like swapped this role?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, like the motivation, I think that's a really big factor. One thing that, just if I can quickly go back to the other point before, and I saw a comment, is university teaching like pedagogy or andragogy. I really think it depends on the instructor and the classroom and how things are. So I don't think we can call education, you know, university education in general, any one such thing. Is it task oriented, situational based, problem solving, or is it I'm the teacher and I'm standing here telling you XYZ, what you need to learn? So as I came from teaching English as a second language, I would say that even with my adult students, it was very much focused on pedagogy, because they were learning from me, right? I had to start with teach the grammar, and they can't start with let's analyze this literature if they didn't have those basics, those building blocks first. What is a sentence structure? How do we, compose it, and not throwing them the most difficult phrasal verbs, let's say. So I was in that mindset. And when I got my first L&D role, it came about a little kind of naturally. I was working as a recruiter, and when new recruiters came in, I just kind of naturally wanted to help them do the job. And I was, eventually given the role of learning and development manager to help with that, the processes and how to be a recruiter. And I actually implemented e-learning at that company. And I remember one of the first e-learnings that I did, I said, okay, boom, you guys have to do this, and then we'll have a discussion about it later. And the manager said, give me the tracking, check and see who did it. And not a lot of people did it. And to me, it's kind of like, why not? And this is obviously before I knew anything about adult learning theories, Andragogy. Why didn't you do it? It's required learning, So for me, that was my biggest struggle, because I was so used to students saying, hey, you have to do this homework, you have to read this, do these exercises, fill in this workbook, and they did it. And so then now being in the situation where it's like, they're not doing the course, why not? Of course, on the one hand, you have to self-reflect and make sure that you're creating and engaging e-learning, but also realize that what I learned was I wasn't giving the learners the why, the what's in it for them. So I think this also goes back to that message in the chat about mandatory corporate training. It needs to be phrased in a way that shows what the learner is going to get out of it, how it's going to impact them, and either help them, make them more efficient in their job, make them more aware, more understanding of their customers, whatever it may be. But to me, I think that was the biggest learning that I had. You can't just tell people, hey, this is mandatory learning, especially for adults, without letting them know and understand what they're going to get out of it, how it's going to help them.
Awesome. I got hung up on your mention of the word what's in it for them, or what's in it for you. Because I think that's such an important thing and when I think about my the reason why I did so poorly in maths is because I could never understand why am I supposed to know how a Cartesian plane works or whatever. And I keep thinking, if I could just go back to my child self and just tell my child self that one day you're gonna have to use this in this context, or to go back to accounting class and where I wasn't paying attention to Excel formulas and stuff, and now I'm doing Excel formulas every bloody day. I'm like, if I only really mastered this from a younger age, So Matthew, I'm curious about, from your perspective, how do you communicate that what's in it for you? Because for adult learners, they have a lot more past experiences, so you can draw on them. You can say, for this specific corporate context, we have to do corporate training because the whole organization can tank and we all might be in big trouble if we don't do X, Y, Z. But for younger learners, how do you translate that, what's in it for me? Why should I be learning how to code, for example?
Yeah, thanks, Will. There's been so many interesting comments, and Brenna, that was some really interesting insight. There's something I want to touch on from a lessons-based perspective, but there's a few things from Code for Kids that we've done very practically. And so maybe just to start with, from a student's perspective, we do always start with the why. And I love somebody said that in the chat. I always joke, I didn't start an education company because I had the best school. I didn't enjoy school much, right? And it was the exact same kind of frustration Will feels. So what we do in Code for Kids, the very first 15 minutes that a 10-year-old is using Code for Kids, or any age, in fact, but as young as 10, or it gets a bit younger, in fact, they are building a website, and that website is shareable. It's on their country. So if they're living in America, in South Africa, in India, in New Zealand, they're creating this website on their country, and they can share that. So within 15 minutes, that's the thing the teacher pipelines straight towards, and it's customized as them. It's their website, and then the teacher goes backwards and kind of fills in the gaps. So we try and get the students to learn, in this case it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but they have no idea what those concepts are. They've just created something that the world can see, and then we start to fill in the knowledge that go in the back. We call these things sort of these wave curves. And what we mean by that is we don't want a student to go too far ahead, but we want a student to go very deep into a content without getting ahead of everyone else. So you'll see that the majority, all the students need to get to the end, And then the last 30% of depth, you'll see that the students, 30% of the students, sorry, will go a little bit deeper into the content. And that's kind of how we design that. One of the things, how we do this very practically, one of the courses that Code for Kids is a course on Excel or Google Sheets. And just to use the practical example that we talked about Excel formulas, one of the things we do, the very first lesson, the very first task in the first lesson, I believe, the students go through and do every row, they retype 3 + 2, 4 + 4, they go through it and they type it. And this is obviously a total headache. So it's been designed in a way that we've observed classes that it annoys enough students, but not far enough that they kind of quit. And then the teacher shows them, oh, well, you could do this formula. And then you see them all go and type this formula. And oh, that's pretty cool. And then the third one, but it's still a bit of a headache. And the third one, they just drag and drop it. So it's intended to kind of say frustration. And then like, here's oh, and then it gets to the point where the teacher's not even showing them how they could apply it in the end. The student is meant to make the connection. Oh, I could just take what I've learned here and apply it backwards there. And like I said, the teachers we observe, so that's how the student is learning, but the teachers we observe that do that the best are the teachers who give enough space for the students to figure that out, for the students to like discover it themselves. The teachers we kind of really have to show with are like, stop telling the students, let them discover it, plant some seeds rather. So yeah, I hope that kind of gives some insight from the Code for Kids. There's maybe one thing I can touch on from a lesson-based perspective. Because the word engagement was used, and this is something we've recently been thinking a lot about. Lesson space, it's mostly just a whole bunch of engineers and teachers sitting around trying to develop a very interactive whiteboard and graphing tools and text editors and various things. And we're getting, thousands of people using the software. And there's lots of data on how they're using the software. Now, we don't know what engagement is if you think of it as like, when is someone engaged in a binary yes or no? They are engaged or they're not engaged. There's kind of this gray area between being totally disengaged and totally engaged. So we asked ourselves, what is definitely, without question, engagement? What does that definitely look like? And for us, that definition was talking or doing. So if a student is talking or doing something, they are 100% engaged. I can't tell you what happens on the like gray area, and I can tell you that if a student's not looking at the screen or not listening, they're not engaged. But if a student is talking or doing, we can then say that's engaged. So everything that we are trying to build is trying to make it very easy for a student to be engaged by talking or doing. So we consider a lesson more successful if we release a feature and we find more engagement, i.e. the student is doing more as it relative to the teacher, and the student is talking more relative to the teacher. That's kind of, I said we talk about Bloom's 2 Sigma study. The second thing we believe is active learning, and that active learning is definitely engagement in kind of our definition of it. I know that's like a lot of information at once. Thanks.
That was a really cool example. I think that's awesome. I think to some extent we've and this is a curveball question, Matthew and Brenna, that we didn't talk about before, so brace yourselves. We like a theme that came up earlier that I wrote it down here was scaffolding. It's how do you create the structures in the journey to ease them into like a good experience, and like Matthew, you described a beautiful example of scaffolding, where you get them to like do something first and in a really like time-consuming way, and then doing it more efficiently and then super efficiently. My question like to you is, what are your perspectives about scaffolding in your industry? I feel, at least from the adult learning I've experienced, like I can be a bit more, a bit more liberal with the scaffolding. We can trust our adult learners to kind of find their way. They won't get lost as easily, and sometimes they might even find their why differently. Like you can give them an open-ended question, say, why are you doing this course? Where maybe for children you can say, here's a really nice scenario, this is why we're trying to help this character to solve this problem. That might be a why or something. What are your thoughts about that? How would you scaffold your various experiences for your different audiences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing that I I don't know if it would be maybe under the umbrella of scaffolding, but one thing I think for adults that we can do, pulling off that idea that they are already coming in with experience and prior knowledge, when I'm designing a course, depending of course on the topic, it's to have the knowledge check maybe first. So it's something that on the one hand, you're already learning, right? Because you're reading the questions, maybe remembering, answer the questions. And then based on that, it really helps them self-direct, choose their learning, because if they already come in with some level of base knowledge, they can either choose to, do the course, go through the information again, or choose to skip it because they have that information there. So that's one thing that, depending on the topic, that I really like to do, because you can say, all right, I have enough of this base knowledge. I can, continue, I can go to the next level, or I can, find these additional resources and learn more about this topic before moving on. So that allows them to kind of choose their path as well. And I think you could do something similar with scenarios, with branch scenarios as well, where you're actually putting them in the environment, and they have to choose, what would you do? And then from there, you can either, send them to learn a bit more, or keep them going because you can see that they already have that information. So I think that's a good way to kind of take the knowledge that they have and either, let them choose to learn more or continue on in the corporate world, at least.
Yeah, Brenna, I mean, maybe if I could just jump in there, because just on that point, I think it's something actually also, Will, we've discussed in length in the past, is we talk about a highly framed environment and then letting it go a little bit more kind of self-directed. And I think one of the mistakes we were making in the early days, we didn't frame it highly enough in the beginning. So there was a huge amount of this kind of, I see that there's a discussion of like, what's your tolerance for frustration? We were noticing that was too high, just qualitatively, not through any kind of data. We would observe a class and we saw there was too much frustration too quickly. The students didn't feel like they had achieved anything because it started off too wide. And then as we kind of created this much more highly framed environment, where it was very easy to get the first 3 things done. It wasn't rocket science, and then it got a little bit less wide as we went by. And that's something that certainly has changed how we think about courses, and something that's not mentioned much here, and I know it makes less of a difference in adult, or we haven't spoken about it. I'd love, Brenna, to hear your thoughts on it, is the concept of gamification. Because how do you leverage that in a kind of ethically correct way and a way that's useful? One thing we've done, I mean, it's a bit ridiculous to how we've tried to think about it, but we talk about training the teacher, and this comes back to also start with the why. With Code for Kids as an example, we consider everyone in the ecosystem, not only the student, also the teacher, the school, and the parent. And one of the things we've realized is that the student gets to show their website to the parent. The parent says, wow, school, this was really great. And even the student can make a website on their school, which then maybe the school puts in their newsletter. But we thought about, where does the teacher get highlighted? Where do we show that the teacher's learning something here through our academy? And it was something as simple as formalizing our training, creating it something that it became a little bit more, here's the deliverables that you have to achieve, this many hours of that, this many hours of that, this feedback on that. But then we just put something as simple as a footer in an email that we gave our teachers, so that they could show off and show that they had achieved a level 1 certification, or a level 2 or level 3. And that was a massive motivator to get more teachers to go through the course. So it's just an interesting sort of maybe spanner throw in the works. Brenna, I'd love to hear how you think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I love that example. And I think that the gamification is something that is equal for adults and kids. Everyone likes to incorporate some fun elements, right? Whether it's to bring back some nostalgia or to get something that you can then be proud of to show. So in the past, I've worked with, different kind of badges, certifications, things like that, that people can show, but also, and this was especially true working with Genially, because they have all of these kind of gamification templates that you can use to really incorporate some more kind of fun. I did a masterclass on Genially for really big client, and I started it out with like a Jeopardy almost kind of game show where we asked questions, and it got the bing, 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 you know, the sound effects and the fun and like the confetti falling down, things like that. And people, they were so engaged. They had so much fun with it. And they're learning at the same time. So, you know, I think gamification is something that we should keep in mind regardless of who the learners are. And that can be pretty easy to, you know, to accomplish and to implement on even on a smaller scale.
I think this maybe leads on to another question I have. Again, putting you on your feet here, on your toes. Is that the right term? Anyways, so earlier here, Megan mentioned the zone of proximal development, and Megan asked whether there's a difference between getting into that you know, like ZPD for younger learners versus for adult learners, and that made me think about, for adult learners it might be a bit harder because you don't know, it might be harder to profile your audience, your target audience. So, you know, if in the corporate context, they all come from very, very different experiences. They have very often different levels of understanding of your content or whatever, and then for in terms of desirable difficulty, it might be difficult to where it might be a bit easier for Matthew with children to create that tight scaffolding or framing to guide them on that learning, on that journey. Maybe it's harder for like a room full of adults to get them all, you know, in that sweet spot of I'm just learning and I need a little bit of help to keep going, but I'm kind of independent already. You know, like, what are your thoughts about that, about getting into that sweet spot for the different audiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my main kind of thought would be putting it in the context that's maybe most relevant for the learners. So of course, you said they're all coming with different levels of knowledge. So here is where I would maybe like say that Andragogy as a theory is really important, and that we kind of try to check off as many of those boxes of meeting the principles as possible, right? So that is that they're there because they have that internal motivation, that they are bringing in some past knowledge to it, even if it is different, that they understand the why. And even though the why might be different for each of them, that they each have it. Relevance, I think, is extremely important. And an adult is, you know, they're just not going to learn or be engaged in learning if they don't see how it's relevant to them. And again, this might be, depending on the case, of course, it might be different. And that there's some, at least kind of some sort of self-direction, that they can, you know, choose, maybe here's these readings or this, they can choose kind of how they want to get in there, or there's a video, or you can read an article, or you can do both, you know? So I think it's definitely harder for adults. So there I would really go with the theory and say, being able to say that at least all of these assumptions, that the assumptions and principles of Andragogy are met, is where you're gonna find that sweet spot with the majority of them, if not everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult one. I've spoken about the companies that we have. You know, it's maybe an example is a company we used to have that didn't work very well. It was a failure because we sort of got things wrong, and we learned a lot through the process. And it was a maths tool for students to use, where they kind of just essentially went through like a Moodle plugin, if you like, and went through and answered a lot of these questions that were intended to get progressively more difficult. And the big mistake there was we didn't spend enough time actually observing the students doing it, because we could have built potentially the best technology out there, but it was just not engaging for the student. They kind of were either bored or just frustrated. There was no middle ground. And I think the kind of answer to that question is something that's like, if you're a learning designer, I think one of the big problems we fell into in the early days, and something I see well, not frequently, but I do see, is you can build the best content and think it will just be used very well or used perfectly. Like, you put my LMS there, there's a video, then there's 3 multiple choice questions. We do this and we think like that's it. But if you've on that, you start the video and you already start scrolling through everything else. You're listening on one ear, maybe it's 2, and you sort of jumped ahead, you open something else. It's maybe the real analysis is standing behind the person and watching them talk. When we have this little anecdote to teach us this or remind us of this in our company, and it's called begin with the end in mind. And it applies to learning design as well. And we have, when we first launched our website, in the early days, our very first company we sold a long while ago, we had my youngest brother, who was is a nature conservationist. We asked him to test the content, and we were all engineers, right? So in this example, think of yourselves as all learning designers. And we said to my brother, his name was Mike, we said, you're going to be the first person to use the website. And he went and he started using it, and it was a total and utter disaster. He was just clicking things, he wasn't reading, he wasn't doing anything. We started telling him what to do. And then it was like a light switch moment where we were like, we can't stand behind all of our customers. Mikey is our customer. We have to, and that night, I kid you not, we deleted about 40% of our code base, and we launched it at 2 o'clock in the morning at a fast food restaurant. And it had more success. And what we call that now is the mic test. And where it came from was, we said, in any product, you've got to begin with the end in mind. The end is sales, the end is success for a customer in product terms. So before you procure, before you design, before you manufacture, before you assemble and package and deliver, it's begin with the end in mind. How is this going to succeed for the customer? And we realized through that process that our biggest strength was also our biggest weakness. We were engineers, so we thought everything could be solved with engineering hats. So how we've applied that begin with the end in mind to our design, we keep coming back and saying, we may be like one of our curriculum designers, brilliant engineer. He has a tendency to completely over-engineer, brilliant curriculum design, like he pulls it all together. He has the tendency to completely overdo it. So we're constantly saying, begin with the end in mind. We put him next to a student, just watch the student. And the student's like hitting their head because it's way too complicated. So I think like being like scrutinizing your honesty of like, how is someone using my content? How is my ideal customer using this? What would my mother do with this content? It would probably be embarrassing, but that's the truth. And I think often as learning designers, we have a tendency to say, this is the perfect way that my content will be used. And that content can be thought of as a workshop where you're in a group with people in asynchronously or in a Zoom call. Of course, people are distracted, ask more questions. You know, maybe if it's a smaller group, cameras on. Maybe have something they can, I don't know all the answers, but like scrutinize, what do you do in that situation when you are maybe not bored or not fully engaged? Sorry, a long way around to try and answer that question.
If I can jump in for a second, something that you said, Matthew, reminds me of an instructional design method, which is action mapping by Kathy Moore, which is starting with what do we want the learner to do, and then from there coming up with the strategy and the best way to get that done. So I just wanted to throw that out, that it sounded very, very similar there. And I think, you know, it's important what's the end goal, and analyze, of course, how can we get there.
Yeah, and maybe just to jump right back in there, we've actually had this weird thing happen recently, and I mean recently as in the this year, where there's been in some of our countries where we have Code for Kids, there's now a prescribed curriculum that never used to be as prescriptive. And now we find that there's a far more well-defined learning outcomes. The teachers race through to get to those. So there's far less of a like the content we don't think is having as rich a value because it's been defined as that end. So that end, if you can define that end like so acutely well, do you want people to tell their friends about their course, or do you want them to tick the boxes? Like that action mapping is really glad that the way you connect to those dots there, Brenna. Thank you.
I think this is like a really interesting thing, that maybe it shows a bit of like the disconnect to some extent between the people who teach adults and people who teach younger people often. And I'm like drawn to this. I was looking up different ways people phrase. They talk about outcome-based education in K through 12, and then we have performance, human performance improvement, or HPI or HPT, like in the corporate sector. But the essence is the same. You set the destination first, and then you help them to get there. And the different journeys they take to get to that destination can be a bit more flexible. But it's very, very important, at least from my perspective, to have a really, really good final goal, because it means that we can measure it, and it also means that we can give meaningful feedback and assess against it. All of these things are like really nice touch points. But for me, it's interesting that the same rough concept has very different perspectives, but I guess we can all agree that from the kids' perspective and from the adults' perspective, that having a good goal is really important, and communicating that goal is very important as well. Maybe I can throw another question in there that I thought about when Matthew was speaking earlier, and that's maybe to reflect on the relationship we have to feedback from the facilitator's perspective, and maybe the learner's perspective, as an adult and as a younger learner. What I'm talking about, the mic test, for example, I can imagine if you are in a class in front of a bunch of kids, you probably get that feedback really quickly. But in corporate training, it's often very difficult to get that immediate feedback, because you might develop a module and then that feedback is very delayed in terms of how well your learning material is perceived. What are your thoughts about that? How has your relationship with feedback changed from putting on the different hats?
Brenna, go.
No, go for it.
I think just to sort of reminding ourselves all the time that the customer's feedback is kind of always right, even if it's wrong. It's like if they're saying something, that's clearly a block that needs to be addressed, needs to be quantified and addressed. If every student is not getting past this point, they're doing something wrong. That could be the case. But like really scrutinizing what is it with your content, when if you are in a corporate environment in person and someone's now pulled out their cell phone, why did they pull out their cell phone? That wasn't very nice of them, it wasn't right of them, but what were the 5 minutes before that happened where they pulled out their cell phone and they lost their interest? I think really just scrutinizing the things that annoy you, the feedback that comes in, you almost want to film your session or have a fly on the wall or have someone watching it and just taking tons and tons of notes. And I think we've just become a little bit more accepting that whether we like it or not, it's the customer is right. And the customer in this case is, the school, the teacher, or the student.
Yeah, I love that. I agree with that. In our case, in my case, at my current role, it's true. The feedback comes in, quite a bit later after having done the course, and we have thousands of learners. So it's hard to incorporate a lot of that feedback, but it's good to hear. And I think it makes you also self-reflect as a learning designer on how you can improve. So I think besides improving your content, you're also always improving as a professional as well with every feedback that you get. I remember going back to this, again, first role in learning and development, I created a course that I thought was, really cool. It was actually a video. It wasn't even a course. It was a little video with a scenario. This is so-and-so, this is what happened. And then it kind of ended with, why do we think that happened? And certain people in the company got offended by it. And the feedback that I got was, it makes it seem like you're saying that they're not doing their job well. And, we kind of had to have a back and forth, okay, maybe I could have created it a little differently, said it differently, but can we also now as a team reflect and think, why was that your reaction? Like, what are we doing then with that? So I'm a big fan of feedback. I love hearing people's, perspectives, and just improving, because for me, I think every course that I do that I get feedback on, I think the next one that I do is that much better.
Cool. I think maybe we can, if you have any closing remarks, because we're about to wrap up, and I want to see if there's a moment to actually say farewells in enough time. Matthew and Brenna, do you have any final questions or comments? Like, is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you, or is there something we should have talked about that we didn't talk about during the session? And maybe now's the last time if anyone has any questions. I see some questions have been posted.
Yeah, I think just the last comment for me is I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I think it's just scrutinizing what is the reason we doing this course? Why should a student there? Just while you were speaking, I was thinking of language learning, and this is a self-antidote. Like, I have no experience in teaching language, but we all know that the best way to learn a language is speak a language, right? Yet every single school is designed where the teacher just tells you, or you read, it's like, how do you want to learn language? Go and speak it. Yet, like, the system is designed very, very differently. You think of something like Duolingo, and I've got my streak going on Duolingo, and anyone who has Duolingo, they've done a brilliant job on getting you to get that thing done every day. But I still probably haven't learned much in a year. And still, I know the best way to learn a language is for me to go and find a tutor and go and speak that language, or go and roll in, actually have to speak the course or the language. And I think this is kind of my observation of where it is falling short, where I'm ticking the box because it's like, in this case, I'm continuing my streak, but am I actually getting out what I'm trying to get out? And I think the scrutiny over really understanding what it is you need to get out, and then doing that, even if it means it's going to cost more and you're going to charge more for your course because they're going to do it properly, as opposed to doing these kind of half jobs, which they did at school, or Duolingo, which is a great app and school is great, but not quite doing the thing that you're kind of there to. I want to be able to speak fluently. So that's maybe just my closing remark and a bit of a ramble. Thanks.
I like that, but I think it goes back to, again, that kind of part of learn by doing. It's learning is not going to happen if you're just sitting there passively listening. So I think that would be my closing remark, whether it's pedagogy, andragogy, adults, children, we have to get the learner involved and doing. And I think that's what would be my main focus, and kind of saying that if we're, one theory, the other, that's what it's all about, is getting the learner involved and doing.
Cool. I think that also makes me think about before the session, we had a meeting, and I was talking about how, will we have an argument about certain things? Will we say doing this one is more relevant in this context or whatever? But what I think we've kind of come to agree on in this session is that there are fundamental principles that make learning very effective for everyone, and if we can take those principles or those ideas, those let's call them learning design or instructional design principles and concepts, like scaffolding, like the desirable difficulty, feedback, active learning, constructivism, all of these things are universal, they apply to every single context, and we can learn a lot by borrowing from the way Matthew taught someone how to use Excel, and then it translate that maybe into the corporate perspective in a just from a different lens or whatever. So yeah, I think that's my final closing remark. I'm going to give each of you a final moment, maybe to tell us where to find you in the online world, and maybe you can tell us what you're up to. Is there any big project you're working on that people should be looking at in the next few days? Brenna, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So in the social world, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'll put my my social media in the chat there. I am currently, the biggest project I'm working on that is unfortunately not open to the public, but maybe I can find some things that I can adjust a little bit, is going through some learning paths that we have currently that are 100% video based, very passive, and I am revamping them and making them more engaging, more interactive with different multimedia. And it's really exciting. It's a fun project to work on. And I hope that I can, take the skills and what I'm learning throughout this process and kind of transfer it and create some other great courses.
Awesome. Thank you. Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you for having me, Brenna. Will, it was wonderful to speak, and everyone else. I'm basically only on LinkedIn. I'll post my thing there. I'd love to connect. Practically speaking, we're always hiring, and I'm moving to the UK next year. And if anyone is there in London who wants to connect, I'd love to get involved in some communities. So that's really, really all for me. Thanks, Will.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this has been such a awesome session. And maybe we can, for everyone in the chat, if you want to throw in your LinkedIn contact in the chat as well, in case you want other people to connect with you, you can put that in there as well. Brenna and Matt, thank you so much for your time. I think this has been an awesome session, and we've spoken about quite a lot of stuff. And I think the recording from this is going to be great. For those of you who are still here, we will be sharing the recording afterwards. We're going to take a few days to turn it into actually a mini follow-up course on EduFlow. So you can choose to rewatch the recording, do some discussions and activities, and maybe even get a certificate of participation, or you can just watch a YouTube video afterwards. It's up to you, but watch the space. We will be sharing the recording with you afterwards. Tara, I tried to do that everybody say goodbye thing a while ago, and I did so badly. Do you want to do that for us?
Absolutely. I also just wanted to say thank you all so much. It was great to listen. I was going through past trainings that I've done in my head and thinking about the learner experience while you each were talking, and it was very insightful. So I'm excited for the mini course so we can continue some of these discussions. But it's super fun to feel like you were in a room with real people, and you're on Zoom, but it's kind of fun if you just want to unmute and just say goodbye or thank you. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. You can also just pop it in the chat, but feel free to unmute and just say goodbye before you head out, and have a great day.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks so much to the panel.
Thank you, everyone, for